If you have ever looked at your 401k, seen the balance, and thought, that's it, you are not crazy. In fact, that reaction is one of the most normal experiences in long-term investing. Because for a surprisingly long time, retirement saving does not feel powerful. It feels mechanical. You put money in. You do what the experts tell you to do. You take the employer match. You leave it invested. And yet the account often feels like it is moving in inches, not miles. That is the part almost nobody prepares people for. We talk constantly about compounding. We are told to start early, stay consistent, and trust the process. But what many investors do not understand is that compounding is almost invisible in the beginning. The math is working, but the effect is too small to feel important. And that matters because this is exactly where people get discouraged. This is where they stop increasing contributions. This is where they get impatient. This is where they start chasing hot ideas, pulling money out, or deciding that investing just is not doing much for them. But the real story is more interesting than that. There is a point in the life of a retirement portfolio where the whole experience changes. It stops feeling like a container you are filling by hand and starts behaving more like an engine with momentum of its own. That is what I mean by financial escape velocity. It is not a formal technical term. It is a metaphor. But it describes something very real. There is an early stage where your progress depends mostly on your own savings effort, and there is a later stage where the portfolio begins doing more of the work alongside you. If you do not understand that transition, long-term investing can feel deeply unrewarding right up until the moment it becomes powerful. So let's start with the uncomfortable part. In the early years, your portfolio is usually too small for market returns to feel dramatic. If you have $10,000 invested and the market returns 10%, you made $1,000. Mathematically, that is a very good year. Emotionally, it barely registers. For a committed saver, that may be less than a single month of contributions, which means that in the beginning, the market is not the main event. You are. Your savings rate is carrying most of the weight. Your paycheck is doing the heavy lifting. Your discipline matters more than your returns, at least at first. That is why the early phase feels so underwhelming. Not because something is wrong, but because the portfolio is still too small for compounding to feel impressive. This is also why the first major milestone matters so much. People often talk about the first $100,000, and while that number is partly psychological, it also reflects a real shift. If you contribute $10,000 per year and earn 7%, it takes about 7.8 years to reach that first $100,000. And most of that balance came from your own contributions, not from investment growth. That first stretch is labor-heavy. You are building the base. But once the base exists, the pace changes. With the same contribution and the same return, going from $100,000 to $200,000 takes about 5.1 years. Going from $400,000 to $500,000 takes less than 2 years. Nothing magical happened. You did not discover a secret. The arithmetic changed because the base got bigger. That is the part many people never emotionally absorb. They understand compounding in theory, but they do not understand how different it feels when the balance is large enough for percentage gains to start producing serious dollar amounts. And this is where the narrative around retirement saving gets interesting. Early on, your job is simple, even if it is not easy. Your job is to save, increase contributions when you can, capture the employer match, keep costs low, stay invested, avoid doing stupid things. That is most of the game in the beginning. Later, the job changes. Later, the challenge is not only building the portfolio, it is staying out of the way of the momentum you have already created, because as the account gets larger, the emotional experience gets more complicated. A 10% decline in a small account is annoying. A 10% decline in a large account can feel shocking. When a $2 million portfolio drops 10%, you are looking at a $200,000 decline on paper. Even if you know that volatility is normal, that kind of movement can trigger the urge to act. And that is where a lot of investors damage themselves. Not in the beginning, when the numbers are small, but in the middle, when the numbers are finally large enough to matter and fear gets louder. So it helps to think about this journey in stages. The first important stage is what you might call the contribution crossover. This is the point where the portfolio starts generating annual growth that is in the same range as what you are contributing. A useful rule of thumb is that this happens when your invested balance reaches roughly 10 times your annual savings rate, depending on your return assumptions. So, if you are contributing around $24,500 per year, You may begin reaching that first real crossover somewhere in the mid $300,000 range. That is a big moment. Because for the first time, the market is starting to match your annual effort. Your money is no longer just sitting there waiting for you to feed it. It is beginning to push with you. The next stage is even more interesting. That is when annual portfolio growth begins to approach, or in strong years exceed, what you earn from your job. That does not mean you retire on the spot. But psychologically, it is a profound change. Work starts to feel less like economic dependence and more like a choice. And eventually, for those who stay disciplined long enough, you reach the point where a sustainable withdrawal rate can cover your living expenses. That is closer to traditional financial independence. But getting there is not just about time. It is also about avoiding friction. The first major advantage is the employer match. This is one of the best returns available in personal finance because it is immediate. A 50-cent match on the dollar up to 6% of pay is effectively an instant 50% return on that slice of your contribution. That is hard to beat anywhere. The second issue is fees. People underestimate this constantly. A 1% fee sounds small until the account becomes large. On a $1 million portfolio, that is $10,000 per year leaving the system. Over a long career, that drag compounds into real damage. The third problem is leakage. Loans, early withdrawals, and cash outs during job changes may feel manageable in the moment, but they break the compounding chain. A $10,000 withdrawal at age 35 is not just $10,000 gone. It may represent a much larger future shortfall because that money no longer has decades to grow. And then there is allocation. If you get too conservative too early, you may reduce volatility, but you also reduce the growth that helps create escape velocity in the first place. On the other hand, as retirement approaches, risk management matters more. So the goal is not maximum aggression forever. The goal is enough growth to outrun inflation without taking risks that no longer fit your stage of life. So what is the real takeaway? It is that the most discouraging phase of investing is often the phase where you are doing exactly what you should be doing. That is the trap. People assume that if the results do not feel dramatic, the strategy must not be working. But in reality, the early years are supposed to feel labor-intensive. They are supposed to feel slow. You are still building the base that makes later acceleration possible. Then, gradually, the character of the portfolio changes. First, gains begin to matter. Then they begin to rival contributions. Later, they may rival income. And eventually, for some investors, they become large enough to support spending. That is the shift. That is the moment when retirement investing stops feeling like pure effort and starts feeling like momentum. So if your 401k feels unimpressive right now, do not confuse that with failure. It may simply mean you are still in the phase where your savings discipline matters more than your market returns. Keep contributing. Capture the match. Keep fees low. Leave the money alone. And understand that the early part of the process is not exciting because it is not supposed to be exciting. It is supposed to build the machine. And once that machine is large enough, the experience of investing begins to feel completely different. That is financial escape velocity.